Renaming a React Native app is something you'll rarely, if ever, have to do, but if you have to do it, it can be a little intimidating, especially if you're like me, where you got a web development background and you're working in iOS and Android in this case too. Change the name of the application as it is displayed on the iOS home screen or the Android home screen, because we need to actually go into the iOS directory and the Android directory to make those changes, which means we need to actually make some native changes. Fortunately, this has gotten a lot easier for us as web developers working with React Native, and that's through the addition of the app.json file and the React Native eject command. And by using these two new additions, we're able to relatively easily change the application name, the display name of our application for both iOS and Android. As a demo, I'll be using an application I built in my course, Create Your First React Native App, which is hosted on Udemy. There's a link to it down in the description. And as you can see, it's just a basic contact list app. Very straightforward. But if we go ahead and close the application and go to the home screen, you can see that the name for both iOS and Android is just this YFRN app source. And that's not a good name. That doesn't describe what this application is. So we're going to go ahead and change that name to display Contacts Manager on both iOS and Android. Something to note about this app is it does have some native dependencies via React Native vector icons, and you can also see that it's got a custom icon on both platforms. So those are two things we'll have to maintain in the native code. So to actually prepare to make this application name change, we're going to need to copy a few things out of our iOS directory and our Android directory. And if you've already added the icons to your application, then going into these files again won't seem that foreign to you. So looking at the project in my editor, we'll open up the iOS directory, and you can see inside of here there's this YFRN app source directory, and inside of there's this images.exe assets, and that's where our icon files are going to actually be stored. So that's something we want to make sure we copy. As well as in the Android directory, if you go into the app directory, source, main, and then res, there's these mip-map directories, and those are going to be our icons for the Android platform. So we're going to want to make sure we copy those. So I'll open this up in Finder, and what we'll do now is go into our iOS directory, the YFRN app source, or this is going to be whatever your project name is currently, and we're going to copy this images.exe assets and just put that into a separate directory, and we will go ahead and do the same for the Android. Go to the same spot, main, res, and then copy these mip-map directories. So now we've got all of our icons saved, and that's all for my application that I need to copy from my iOS and Android directories. If you've got splash screens for your application or you've made other changes, you'll have to make sure you go ahead and copy those over. And if you've added them, then you have an idea of what went into actually adding them, so taking them out and copying the necessary files should be pretty straightforward for you. So that's all of the preparation we need to do. Now we can go ahead and go back to our project directory. And what we want to do now is go into our app.json, and all we're doing is going to change the display name. And the display name is what the user's actually going to see. This name property in the app.json, that's all for internal use. So for me, that's not something I'm worried about changing. It's perfectly fine the way it is. But for this display name, we're going to go ahead and say Contacts Manager. Go ahead and save this, and then the next thing we need to do is delete the iOS and the Android directory. So I'll go ahead and do that. And with all that completed, we can go ahead and go to our terminal. I'm inside of my actual project directory, and all I need to do now is say React Native eject, and it's important to make sure you delete those iOS and Android directories before you run this eject command. Okay, and then if you see back in the project, the iOS and the Android directories have been created again. If I go ahead and look at a git status, you can see quite a lot has changed here. But especially on iOS, a lot of that's the icon. So if we go ahead and add the icons that we copied before into the project for both iOS and Android, that should reduce the number of changes by quite a bit. So I've got my terminal window open again, and we can see here's the project directory, and here's where I've copied all of those image assets that we had before. So I will go back into iOS. All the paths are the same, and then I'll just copy over images.exe assets, replace it, and then go back to the Android directory, app, source, main, res, and then copy over these files. Replace everything. Okay, so now all of our icons should be good to go. So we'll run another git status, and you can see that the number of changes has reduced down quite a bit. The next thing we need to take care of is any native linking, which in this case for my application is going to be for the React Native vector icons. And fortunately, since that is set up to work with React Native Link, all we need to run is React Native Link, and everything has been successfully linked for us. So again, running that git status, you can see now we've only got 4 files that are changed. If we look at the diff for the Android app directory, you can see all that's changed is the app name here, and we already know how we changed the app.json. In reality, this project.pbxproj, there's nothing in there we need to change. So you can just leave that as is. Everything in my case that was changed is related to the vector icons. The last thing that you might want to look into is the info.plist for your iOS directory. And that's because it's been overwritten from before. It'll have the new application name. But if you've made any changes to that, for example, made different permission requests, you'll have to go ahead and add those back in at this point. So that's really all we have to do. At this point, what we want is to open up the React Native packager, which is running in a new terminal window for me. Actually quit that. And then I want to say React Native run iOS. And now I'll run React Native run Android. Okay, and we can see that the application is now running on both iOS and Android again. If I go ahead and close this, go to the home screen on both apps, you can see that indeed Contacts Manager is used on iOS as well as on Android. Now there's a fair amount that goes into it. It's just copying and pasting a few commands, but you want to make sure you're not breaking anything in your application. So be sure to prepare, just have an idea of what's going on in those iOS directories and Android directories. Obviously using Git or some other source control will help you actually view those changes and make sure you can inspect and check that everything's good to go. And my final piece of advice is, if you think you're going to change the name of your application and you're going to do it through this manner, try to do it as early as possible with as few native dependencies as possible, because then it'll just be much, much easier for you and you'll have a lower likelihood of making any sort of mistake. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my email list, which I'll have linked down below for any other tips and tricks for React Native. Also, if you're interested in creating your first React Native app or just improving your foundational knowledge, check out the course below, Create Your First React Native App. It's 3.5 hours of content on Udemy, and it'll get you building your first React Native app and reducing some of that frustration that goes along with actually creating that first app. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you on the next video.